Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. We're pleased to welcome Robert Bryce, a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, who's been writing about the energy sector for more than 2 decades. Robert, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me, Bill.
Robert, you made your bones as an author and a journalist taking crooks and cronies to task in the oil industry. More recently, you've turned your attention to biofuels, and that's why I asked you to join us. What was the original promise of biofuels, and why did they attract so much attention from both environmentalists and politicians?
It's a good question, Bill, and it's one that goes back, you have to go back decades to look at where this idea originated. And even back into the 20s, where you had chemists saying, well, we can convert plant materials into motor fuel. But it really began in the modern era in the 1970s after the Arab oil embargo and the claims that, OPEC was going to cut us off or that there wasn't going to be enough oil to go around. And in particular with a piece that Amory Lovins published that said we can meet all of our transportation needs by using plant materials, by converting them into fuel for our vehicles. And ever since then, we've been inundated with these claims that somehow we can run our transportation system, we can get off of foreign oil if only we turn more corn, more trees, more plant material, grass into biofuels. And the fact is, it has never reached any kind of level that has been any kind of game changer, and we're still waiting after 4 decades of mandates and subsidies to see this industry make any significant inroads in terms of overall supply.
Well, it seemed like the oil import problem has been solved by the frackers while no one was looking, but what role do the environmentalists have in pushing biofuels more lately with concerns about climate change?
Well, it's interesting that you look at the big environmental groups, Greenpeace, Sierra Club, Friends of the Earth, etc., they have effectively just kept silent, despite numerous studies that have come out. In fact, one of the ones that I thought was most interesting came out from the Environmental Working Group last May, where they used the EPA's own data and found that corn ethanol emits more CO2 over its lifetime than does even the Canadian tar sands. So this idea that deriving motor fuel from plant material is a good idea has been debunked over and over again. And just to be more specific, what the Environmental Working Group did was show that the use of corn ethanol in the United States would result in more CO2 emissions than would the Keystone XL pipeline if it were built. But this belief in biofuels has been gospel to the green left for decades, and I dare the Sierra Club or Greenpeace activists or any of these other so-called Greens to really call it out, because it's been part of the Democratic platform now for decades, and they're reluctant to speak out against what is a failed policy that's costing taxpayers over $10 billion per year, motorists $10 billion per year, over and above what they pay for gasoline alone.
Well, it must be a winner for them from a fundraising perspective. So let's turn over to the money side and dig a little deeper into corn ethanol, since that really seems to be the big gorilla in the biofuels room. Exactly how big is the corn ethanol business, and who profits from it?
Well, let's put it into scale. And you mentioned the issue of hydraulic fracturing earlier, and that's a great point to make and to put this into perspective. So what is the scale of the corn ethanol scam today? Here's an industry that is consuming roughly 40% of all the corn grown in America to produce what is the equivalent of 600,000 barrels of oil per day. Now, remember, the total volume of ethanol produced is about 900,000 barrels per day, but ethanol contains only about 2/3 of the heat content of gasoline, so you have to cut that down.
Okay.
So the reality is we're producing about 600,000 barrels of oil equivalent from ethanol today. Well, just since 2009, domestic oil production has increased by 3.6 million barrels per day. So in a span of 7 years, the domestic oil production improbably has increased by 6 times the output of every corn ethanol producer in the entire country, and it took them 4 decades of mandates and subsidies to get to that level.
Well, how much does corn ethanol blending mandates actually cost consumers at the pump?
Well, this is something that I worked on, and I published a paper for Manhattan Institute about a year ago on this very issue, because I started looking at the cost comparison just on a volumetric basis, right? Looking at a gallon-for-gallon cost of ethanol versus gallon-for-gallon cost for gasoline. And I used a data set from the state of Nebraska, because they've been collecting data since the 1980s on this volumetric comparison. And then I took it one step further and I said, okay, well, let's compare them on an energy equivalent basis. So you need 1.5 gallons of ethanol to equal a gallon of gasoline to have them an equal volume or equal quantity of energy. Mm-hmm. So I took the ethanol prices, multiplied them by by 1.5, and lo and behold, ever since the 1980s, ethanol on an energy equivalent basis has always been more expensive than gasoline. So what's the punchline? Today, motorists are paying roughly $10 billion more per year due to the corn ethanol scam than they would if they were able to buy just pure gasoline.
Which corporations are the top recipients of government support in the corn ethanol business?
Some of the biggest producers have been Archer Daniels Midland. There's a big company called Poet. Interestingly enough, Koch Industries has, the demon Kochs, the Koch brothers, they're demonized routinely. Bernie Sanders, after he essentially tied Hillary Clinton in Iowa, demonized Koch Industries. Well, Koch Industries is now in the ethanol business. So is Valero, one of the biggest refiners in America, owns ethanol plants. Why? I think that I haven't asked them, I haven't interviewed them, but it seems to me it's simple. They saw these ethanol plants go bankrupt. They understood that they were under a federal mandate that required them to blend ethanol into their fuel. And they said, well, can't beat them, might as well join them. And so now you have some of the biggest refiners in the country are in the ethanol business as well.
Are the corn ethanol refiners big political donors?
Well, they have a lot of political sway. And, of course, this is going to be the key test is in the wake of the Iowa caucuses where Ted Cruz won and was an ethanol critic. Now, he backed off some of his comments later in the campaign, saying, well, I'm just for the free market, I'm not opposed to ethanol, and kind of soft-pedaled what he'd said earlier. But Cruz is the first candidate in the history of the Iowa caucuses to not stand up and support corn ethanol and end up winning. So will this change immediately? No, but to me it's remarkable that Cruz did as well as he did.
How many actual farmers are on the corn dole?
Well, that's a good question. I can't answer that, Bill. What I would say is that if you have an industry that's taking 40% of the total production of corn, if you're in the corn business at all, then here's an industry that's taking 40% of your production, then it, of course, affects their price, affects their overall market. And now it's become a major part of the business.
So the answer is all of them.
Well, I guess in theory, yeah, that's probably true.
What about water consumption? How much water does it take to produce a gallon of corn ethanol?
Boy, you're hitting me with some really good questions here, and I have those numbers. I published them, in fact, in my third book, Gusher of Lies, looking at data that showed the volume of water required by ethanol versus that required by conventional gasoline. Mm-hmm. I don't have those numbers at hand, but I know it's an order of magnitude, maybe 2 orders of magnitude greater for ethanol than it is for gasoline.
So why is it that corn ethanol continues to receive so much political support despite the massive cost to consumers and despite the damage to the environment?
I wish I understood. My read is that actually the corn ethanol scammers are on the run. I mean, that they've been hit so hard by coverage in the popular media. I had a piece in the New York Times about a year ago pointing out the higher cost of ethanol. But remember, you have a lot of farm states, and you still have, even though Cruz won in Iowa, you still have the Iowa caucus being effectively the first presidential primary. Mm-hmm. So you have the power of the farm lobby, the power of the corn lobby, a lot of farm state senators, and you have the Iowa caucuses, and all those things remain very powerful.
If ethanol mandates were eliminated altogether, would the market price of corn ethanol be larger or smaller than the cost of corn production?
Would the amount of ethanol blended into gasoline fall? I think it would if the mandate went away, because that would allow the refiners to simply decide that they're going to go with the lowest cost ingredients, and that may or may not include ethanol. But what my point is on the mandates is, why does this industry need a mandate? If they're making a product that's good, why are we required to buy it? Everybody loves to demonize the oil industry, loves to demonize the gas industry. Well, there are no rules that require me or you or anyone else to buy their product. But yet we have a mandate that requires us to buy what is, in fact, an inferior product that costs more than conventional gasoline. And call me a crazy free market guy, but I think that's wrong.
Robert, once upon a time, environmentalists, politicians, scientists, and even venture capitalists promoted the idea that corn ethanol was only a temporary bridge to cellulosic ethanol made from things like switchgrass and other non-food crops. What's become of that promise?
It's been one of the biggest jokes of the modern era. You had 10 years ago, Vinod Khosla, who's the famous venture capitalist in Silicon Valley, claiming that, this is brain dead simple. That was his quote. This is brain dead simple to do, and we can make biofuel, we can make motor fuel out of pretty much anything, and we're going to solve this. So Khosla was involved in all kinds of different companies. Here's another one from Khosla. He said in 2006, he said, we can replace most of our gasoline needs in 25 years with biomass. So he started a company called Range Fuels. Range Fuels got a $76 million grant from the Department of Energy, as well as an $80 million loan guarantee. And Range was supposed to make biofuels out of wood chips. What happened? It failed. Today, Khosla is facing a lawsuit being sued personally by the state of Mississippi over the failure of another of these companies that claimed they could make cellulosic ethanol, a company called Kyor, and it failed. It filed for bankruptcy in 2014. The state of Mississippi is now suing the company over a $75 million loan that it gave to Khosla and the other people involved in the company. We've just seen failure after failure after failure in this sector, and it's because the fundamental idea is wrong. You cannot make a massive scale-up of motor fuel based on plant materials. The physics just simply don't work.
Well, what about algae? Isn't algae at the forefront of the biofuels craze today?
If you'd said that 4 or 5 years ago, I would have said yes, absolutely. But what have we seen in the last 4 or 5 years? The same thing that we've seen among these companies that claim they could turn wood and sawdust and unicorn farts and everything else into motor fuel. It hasn't happened. And why hasn't it happened? Again, the problem is scale. So you've had companies that promoted this idea about algae. I think one of them was called Sapphire. There was another one called Solazyme. Well, once they realized that to really create the kind of massive volumes that are required to play in a marketplace as big as the 19 million barrel per day oil market in the United States, you have to have a very large operation. And so, say you have some algae that works off sunlight, well, then you have to have a very, very large pond to grow the algae. Well, what happens if leaves fall in there? What happens if, a tree falls over and there's, something else or, bird droppings or whatever else?
Beyond that, what does it cost to buy 100,000 acres of land to grow your algae?
And where are you going to get the water? Because water, particularly in the areas that are sunny, that would be logical places to do it, you're generally short of water. So it became a scale problem. And this is something that I write about all the time. It's power density, energy density, cost, and scale. And scale always comes back to haunt these programs that, it worked great in the lab. Well, it might work great in the lab, but when you try and translate that into supplying the entire state of Texas or the entire state of California or somewhere else with gasoline enough to run it for a year, it becomes a problem.
Several years ago, President Obama launched something called the Great Green Fleet Program to promote the use of biofuels in the military. He recently doubled down on that by instructing the Department of Defense to consider the impact of global warming in all their plans. Exactly what is the Green Fleet Program, and how's it coming along?
Well, to be blunt, Bill, it's just another example of the biofuel scam run amok. And it's one of the examples that in fact, the Secretary of Agriculture, Tom Vilsack, who's a former governor of Iowa, of course, has helped promote. And Hillary Clinton made some noises about, wouldn't it be great when she was campaigning in Iowa a few months ago that if we could just, move more of this biofuels production toward the military, wouldn't that be great? But the problem is that the military has, how is it going to work if we have, say, the Fifth Fleet in the Persian Gulf and we're producing biodiesel in Iowa? Well, it's kind of a long supply chain, isn't it? I mean, why does this help? It doesn't. It doesn't even pass the basic, simple, rational test of, is this really a good idea? It's just another example of how the biofuel scam has been able to obtain federal dollars, and now they looked at the U.S. military and said, hey, here's a really big pot of money. Let's go there, and we'll talk about national security and energy independence, and that we'll use those things to justify siphoning off more money to the biofuel sector, and that's exactly what's happened.
When the military is ordered to buy biodiesel, how much do they pay for it?
Well, it's interesting when they had this demonstration of the Great Green Fleet in San Diego a few weeks ago. Tom Vilsack and the Secretary of Navy, Ray Mabus, flew out onto a guided missile destroyer and watched the ship be refueled with diesel fuel and biofuel. Well, apparently on that contract, the price of the biodiesel was pretty reasonable. But in 2012, the Navy paid $424 per gallon buying biofuel derived from algae. And on another case, they spent $27 per gallon for 450,000 gallons of biofuel. I mean, this is just a classic example. I mean, forget what was it in the 80s? It was the $800 toilet seat and the $500 hammer. We're getting $27 a gallon for biofuel. Are you crazy?
So who are the big corporate winners of Green Fleet?
Well, that's a good question, and one that I can't answer right off the top of my head. I think from what I've seen, it's a lot of fairly small companies or even startups that are getting some of these contracts and grants from the USDA and from the DoD, all in the name of energy independence and so on. So I don't know that it's really big corporate entities that are getting this money. Instead, I think it's just being spread around to a lot of fairly small entities and some startups.
Well, that's how the solar industry went for a while. Robert, most of our listeners are probably familiar with the VW emissions cheating scandal, violating the nitrogen oxide emission standards. How do VW's rigged vehicles compare with the added emissions from ethanol?
Well, thanks for asking. I published a piece on that on Bloomberg View last month. If you look at the EPA's own data, in 2010, they published a 1,100-page document which detailed the economic and environmental impacts of the renewable fuel standard. That's the mandate that requires us to buy ethanol. And they concluded in that document that it would increase the emissions of, I'm quoting now, it will increase emissions of hydrocarbons, nitrogen oxides, particulate matter, and other pollutants, and then, I'm quoting still, will lead to increases in population-weighted annual average ambient PM and ozone concentrations, which in turn are anticipated to lead up to 245 cases of adult premature mortality. So in other words, here's the EPA itself saying that the corn ethanol scam is going to cause early death for roughly 245 Americans every year. So you look at what VW is cheating on the software for their emissions control systems, and ended up allowing those cars to emit more nitrogen oxides. Well, MIT and Harvard did an analysis on those increased emissions, and they estimated those VW-made vehicles will cause about 60 premature deaths per year. So here you have the EPA's own data saying that the corn ethanol scam is 4 times as deadly as the VW scandal, and yet this is law in America.
Small price to pay to keep Iowans happy, I guess.
Well, as long as you're not the one dying, I suppose you're right, Bill.
Robert, you and many others have been writing about this, speaking about this, pointing out the scandal of biofuels for years and years. Hasn't seemed to have done any good.
Well, thanks a lot.
Is there any hope for America kicking its political addiction to failed biofuel programs?
Boy, Bill, I've written about this for 11 years. The first article I published on this was in 2005. I wrote it for Slate, and I talked about the pending legislation then that was going to require corn ethanol consumption. And I made some of the points that I'm making today, that it was going to be costly for consumers, that it wasn't a net energy, it wasn't good, in terms of the energy economics. And yet we've seen an increase in the amount of the mandates. So I want to be optimistic. I really do. I'm optimistic by nature. But when you look at the history of this scandal, and it is a scandal, it is just another classic example of when government gets into a business and and you create a mandate or a subsidy, it is damn near impossible to make it go away.
Robert, your most recent book about innovation is titled Smaller, Faster, Denser, Cheaper. With all this economic policy dysfunction around us, give us a little reason for optimism.
Well, I think there are many reasons to be optimistic, Bill. When you look at the phones we carry in our pockets, when you look at the engines that we use in our automobiles, they are getting smaller, faster, lighter, denser, cheaper. Despite, in many cases, reasons, to be pessimistic and cynical about government in particular and what government is doing, what we see in free enterprise and what we have in a very strong entrepreneurial culture in the United States is this push to improve things. And so despite and I can be as cynical as anybody, but when I look around at how around the world, we're improving living standards. We're bringing people out of the dark and into the light. We're electrifying South Asia. More women are voting. More women are taking part in politics. They're All of these things are very positive trends. And so, yeah, I'm optimistic to the point of idiocy, as the late Molly Ivins used to say. And a lot of that comes from, smaller, faster, lighter, denser, cheaper. But it's my latest book. Buy it. Make sure, buy it on your Kindle. I make a better royalty.
Robert, despite the long fight you've been fighting, you seem to still have plenty of heart to keep at it. Good luck, and thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks a million, Bill.
That was Robert Bryce from the Manhattan Institute here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Real Clear Radio Hour is a partnership with Real Clear Politics, which the New York Times has called an invaluable tool for anyone interested in politics or public affairs. You can check out Real Clear Radio Hour on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at Real Clear Frezza. This week, we'd like to give a special shout-out to our newest listeners in Montgomery, Alabama. We're proud to join the lineup with the River Region's trusted voice, News Talk 93.1. Now broadcast in a dozen cities across America, along with our internet presence on iTunes, YouTube, and SoundCloud. With your help, Real Clear Radio Hour continues to grow. That wraps up our show for this week. Please join us next week, same time, same station. See you then.